my name is Cassandra and in this video I'm going to talk about conflict. Conflict is a very important part in a story because conflict is what makes the readers keep turning the pages and what keeps them awake at night. Conflict is basically the obstacles that the protagonist is going to face in order to achieve their goal. Conflict is external and internal. External conflict can be human against human, so with a villain like many superhero movies. It can be human against society, technology, or monsters or the supernatural. And although I say human, you may not be writing about humans. So it's basically character against character, character against society, against technology, against science, and of course also against nature. Weather conditions, earthquakes, natural disasters. As long as something prevents the protagonist from moving forward toward their goal, then this is conflict. Internal conflict has to do with what the character carries within themselves. So it could be their lack of confidence, it could be self-doubts. Of course, it could also be the fear of disappointing someone else or having to choose between two paths and basically having a moral dilemma. Internal conflict challenges a character's values, their morals, and perhaps the way they grew up and what teachings they received from childhood. The best way to add conflict in your story is to combine the internal and external conflicts. So even if you're writing a story that's full of action and suspense and there are high physical stakes if the protagonist fails, it's still very interesting and it can really touch the readers when the protagonist also faces an internal struggle. Let's use a simple example of adding conflict to a story in order to better understand what works and what doesn't work. So let's imagine that there is a school. We have a school setting and there are the classmates, there is a protagonist and his own group of friends. Now, I know some people really like to imagine idealized situations. So a group of friends where everyone is very friendly with one another and a great teacher and all that. But this is, first of all, it's not realistic at all. And secondly, people don't care. No one's going to care and no one's going to read a story where everything's perfect because there is no point. It's very different for a setting to become sort of idealized, not perfect, but better after facing conflicts, after overcoming difficulties. This is so interesting and rewarding. So let's assume that the protagonist perhaps is having an argument with one of their friends, or perhaps things are stable in the beginning, so there are no arguments. At the same time, we have not yet discovered what the protagonist's goal is. We just have a school setting. Let's assume that the protagonist is someone who is not special in any way, a normal average kid. And what if suddenly one of their friends goes missing? And more than that, what if this person, the protagonist, knows a piece of information that may help the police, but they cannot reveal it to them because perhaps it's something illegal, maybe he did something with his friend that they shouldn't have been doing, so he cannot tell the police, but what he knows may actually help solve the case. So what he does, instead of telling anyone about it and perhaps endangering his freedom, he takes it on himself to search for his friend. I don't know if there are movies or books with this plot. I'm sure there are, but let's use it in order to understand conflict. And perhaps there are other friends from his group that know about this information and can help the protagonist search for his missing friend. So by simply coming up with this event, his friend going missing and him knowing some information about that, or perhaps a piece of information that could help in finding him, we have, first of all, a goal. He wants to find his friend. And we have the stakes. His friend may be killed, tortured, gone in another dimension, I don't know. And there is also the stakes of him being in danger, the protagonist, if what he did with his friend was discovered. So at the same time, we also have conflict, which is his friend missing. He doesn't have any information about it. He doesn't have perhaps solid clues on where he could be. The police is investigating and perhaps they start suspecting him. Maybe he has, there are arguments with his friends. Who knows what they were doing, and maybe he's afraid that they will tell on him. So these things are conflicts that we keep adding to our story. The protagonist is both at a bad place emotionally, but also externally he is in danger in one way or another, either through the police finding out what he did with his friend, or perhaps what they did created other enemies, perhaps a gang or supernatural creatures. Anything goes here. It depends on our imagination and what genre is the story that we are writing. Something important to remember when it comes to conflict is that conflict has to be meaningful and it has to be tied to your plot. And of course, it has to be tied to your protagonist's goal. In this example, let's say that the protagonist had great financial difficulties. Okay, this is a bad situation, but it doesn't work as a conflict if it doesn't affect the plot. If it doesn't create an obstacle for the protagonist to find his friend, unless, of course, he needed to travel or to do something that would require money. Even if we made the protagonist have an accident and he breaks his leg or something like that, as long as he doesn't need to run from the police, it's not a conflict. Yes, it's a bad situation, it's an accident, but that doesn't mean that it's a conflict. Not every bad situation in our story is conflict. It has to be purposeful. It has to be an obstacle to the protagonist's goal. Another important thing to remember, which actually makes stories very interesting, is that conflict should not just be dealt with immediately and then we no longer have to worry about it. In our example, the police will keep investigating for the friend's disappearance throughout the whole story. So even if the protagonist lies in the beginning and they don't suspect him for some time, eventually the police officer's initial thoughts of the protagonist having something to do with his friend's disappearance will come again to the surface. And now perhaps the protagonist doesn't have a way to lie his way out of it. So the initial conflict, maybe it calmed down for some time, but then it will come to the surface again. And that's very interesting when writing a story, when the conflict isn't just dealt with and is gone that easily. And conflict oftentimes goes in par with the stakes. It's important to have high stakes for the conflict to work. The stakes are basically what's at risk. So in this case, it's the protagonist's safety as well as his friends. If the protagonist did not do anything illegal with his friend, and if the only stake was his friend's safety, yes, that would be an interesting scenario still. Of course, it's his friend, he cares about him, they have shared moments, he wants him to be well. But the more we raise the stakes, the more interesting our story is, and the more the readers are going to care about the protagonist and how he's going to face all the conflict that we are going to throw at him in order to reach his goal, in order to be safe and to help and save his friend. So, while I'm talking about the stakes, it's also very important for the protagonist to have a clear goal, because if there is no goal, there are no stakes, and there will not be any conflict, because conflict are the obstacles that prevent the protagonist from reaching their goal. So yes, the conflict is very important. It's a very important element in a story, but it cannot work alone. We have to be aware of many elements in a story and to try to blend them together to have a very beautiful and impactful result. Of course, there are also stories that are not action-driven, so the conflict is basically internal. And it's very interesting to try and analyze these stories and to understand the protagonist, their goal, their inner world, and the obstacles that may not be as clear as in an action-driven story. It will not be a physical enemy, but it could be a mindset. It could be one thought that says, "You're not good enough," that prevents the protagonist from reaching whatever their goal is, which could be as simple as self-identity, as understanding who they are, self-knowledge, and gaining confidence and trust in themselves. So there are many different kinds of stories, different kinds of conflict, different stakes, different characters, different goals. And that's the magic of stories. So think carefully of what the conflicts are in your story and expand on them. Don't just get stuck in one conflict. Have a clear image of what the goal of your character is and know the stakes of your story. What's going to happen if your protagonist fails? That's a very important question. On a final note, I want to say, if you're new to writing, I am as well. And it's impossible to know everything from the start. And it's the worst thing you can do to just sit and study and do nothing else. I did this for years and it did not help at all, because when I actually started writing, I saw how different it is to put everything in action. And when you write, you should not think. Do not start thinking and filling your head with all the musts of a story. Oh, you must have a lot of conflict, you must have high stakes. You should, first of all, think of who your character is, what is their goal. Some things you need to have figured out from the beginning in order to start writing your story. Some others don't do that. They just have a scene in mind and they start writing and working on that. Do whatever works for you But I do not want you to be overwhelmed in any way with all of this, because writing is a beautiful, beautiful and organic process. The more you do it, the more naturally it comes to you, and ideas will pop in your mind, and you will see what works and what doesn't work. And the more you read books, you will notice things, you will notice patterns, you will understand, oh, here starts the inciting incident, oh, they have this and this kind of conflict, and it's ongoing, and the stakes are now there. They started here, but now they are there because some things have changed, and it's magical. And I believe that the vast majority of the authors who created these books did not come up with everything before they started writing. I believe that writing and great stories just come naturally to you when you start writing. I really trust in the creative force of the world, the universe, the ether, whatever you want to call it. I really believe that it comes to all of us when we start writing, and it's a beautiful and magical process. So do not overthink about it. Yes, there are some things you need to pay attention to and you need to include in order to have a compelling story. But that's why writing is divided in drafts. So we write the first draft where we basically just write all the events that are happening in the story. We throw ideas on paper, we type like crazy, things that come to our minds. We will make many mistakes, of course, and as we write, and the more we write, we start understanding our characters better, and we start realizing that maybe the initial goal wasn't so strong, and oh, they actually want this thing, and oh, the stakes are that and that. There are people who work better with having a very solid foundation in their mind about these facts. But even if you do, there are many chances that when you write, new things will come to you. And maybe you will end up deleting chapters and adding other chapters, adding subplots, and creating a whole other world just by writing, because things will come to you. So trust in the process. Trust in the process. Don't overthink. Have some foundations from the beginning. If you want to, try to do that. But don't overthink. Just let creativity come to you and embrace the process. Comment what type of conflict have you watched in movies or have you seen in books that did not quite work and you didn't really care about it, or you thought that perhaps it was repetitive, perhaps it was very surface level, and the stakes weren't that high. If you try to analyze this in books, you will be able to tell the difference and how everything works together. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video helpful and educating and inspiring perhaps. Like the video if you enjoyed the content, and I will see you again in the next video. Bye bye.